All right, buckle up, Buttercup, because today we're diving headfirst into the Department of the Interior.
Ooh, exciting.
It is. You sent over a pretty hefty document on the DOI, and
It's a bit of a beast.
it is a beast. And to be honest, I'm a little scared to even open the cover.
Well, lucky for you, I'm here to help.
That's why you're here. I'm so glad. So, for those of us who haven't memorized the entire Federal Register, what does the Department of Interior even do?
Well, they're responsible for managing about 1/5 of the entire United States. A mind-boggling 500 million acres of federal land.
500 million acres.
500 million acres, that's more land than most countries.
I was going to say that's bigger than some countries, so it's like managing a giant park. But I'm guessing it's not all Yellowstone and Yosemite out there.
No, it's definitely not all scenic vistas and happy campers. They also manage 700 million acres of what's called subsurface mineral estates, meaning they control what happens below ground, too.
Okay, so not just the trees, but also what's under the trees.
Exactly. Coal, oil, natural gas, you name it. If it's under the ground on federal land, the DOI has a say in how it's managed.
This is starting to sound less like a walk in the park and more like, I don't know, spelunking through a minefield of bureaucracy.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually.
Wait, it? Okay, good. So we've got vast landscapes, we've got valuable resources. What else falls under the DOIs? What is it, jurisdiction?
One of the most crucial and often overlooked aspects of the DOI is its trust responsibilities to 566 Indian tribes. It's a complex relationship rooted in a long history of treaties and promises, some kept and many sadly broken.
Yeah, that's a whole other layer of complexity we definitely need to unpack. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's back up a bit. When and why did this department even come to be?
Well, the DOI was established back in 1849, and its initial focus was on managing the country's westward expansion. Think land surveys, Indian affairs, establishing new territories. It wasn't really until much later, around the time Teddy Roosevelt was president, that the DOI's focus shifted more towards conservation with the creation of the National Park Service.
Which, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say, those two things seem kind of, I don't know, contradictory. Like, are we exploiting the land or are we protecting it? Make up your mind.
And that right there is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because those competing priorities, resource development versus preservation, have been a source of tension within the department ever since. And that brings us to our favorite topic, the war on the West.
Ooh, yes. Our source material really paints a picture of how political winds have shaped the DOI's mission, especially from the Carter administration onwards.
Right. See, before Carter, the DOI operated in a relatively bipartisan manner. But then environmental awareness started growing in the 1970s, and suddenly everyone had an opinion on how public lands should be managed. Carter's pro-environment policies, while well-intentioned, really rubbed a lot of people in the West the wrong way.
They basically said, thanks, but no thanks, we'll manage our own backyard.
Pretty much. They felt like their local economies, many of which relied heavily on things like logging, mining, and oil and gas extraction, were being overlooked, even disregarded.
So enter stage right, Ronald Reagan, the original sagebrush rebel.
Exactly. Reagan was all about states' rights, and he wasted no time trying to roll back some of those environmental regulations.
Deregulation nation. But I'm guessing that didn't exactly sit well with the environmental groups.
You could say that. They saw it as a blatant attack on public lands and a dangerous step backwards for conservation.
So we've got this tug of war, right? Protect versus develop, trees versus jobs, and it seems like every administration since Reagan has been caught in the middle.
Absolutely. Take the first Bush administration. They tried to find some kind of middle ground, but ended up frustrating both sides in the process.
That tale as old as time. So what about Clinton? He was all about saving the trees, right?
Clinton was definitely a turning point. He took a much stronger stance on environmental protection, putting stricter regulations on industries operating on public lands. And then there was that whole thing with the wolves.
The wolves?
Yeah, the reintroduction of wolves near Yellowstone National Park. Conservationists loved it, but a lot of ranchers and local folks, not so much.
Can you blame them? Nobody wants a wolf knocking on their door asking for a cup of sugar.
You're not wrong. But it became a symbol of this battle between federal authority and local control. And then, of course, we have the younger Bush administration, who didn't really rock the boat too much in either direction.
Keeping things status quo, until Obama came along, that is.
Right. Obama doubled down on environmental protection, pushing for initiatives to fight climate change, limiting oil and gas exploration on public lands. Let's just say it didn't make him a lot of friends in the oil and gas industry.
But then, plot twist, Trump takes the stage and basically says, drill, baby, drill.
That's one way to put it. His energy dominance agenda was a complete 180 from Obama's policies. He rolled back regulations, opened up more public lands for drilling and mining, really went all in on resource extraction.
Talk about whiplash. So where does that leave us with Biden? Is he trying to put the brakes on the drilling frenzy?
He's definitely taken steps to reverse some of Trump's environmental rollbacks, like halting new oil and gas leases on federal lands. And that's reignited tensions with a lot of Western states who see it as a direct attack on their economies.
So the saga continues. Okay, we've established that the DOI is basically a political football getting tossed back and forth between administrations with very different agendas.
That's a good way to put it.
But agendas aside, you can't talk about a government agency without talking about money. And when it comes to the Department of the Interior, well, let's just say money talks. And in this case, it's talking pretty loudly. We'll dig into that juicy topic right after this quick break.
Stay tuned.
Okay, so before the break, we were talking about how the DOI is basically a political football. But agendas aside, you can't talk about a government agency without talking about money. And when it comes to the Department of the Interior, well, let's just say their budget makes my bank account look like a rounding error.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. On paper, the DOI's budget seems pretty lean. We're talking $18.9 billion.
Okay, lean is relative, right? That's still a lot of zeros.
True, but here's the thing. The DOI is actually one of the few government agencies that actually makes money. And we're not talking about selling souvenirs at national parks here.
Wait, hold on. The DOI is turning a profit? How does that even work?
It all comes down to something called offsetting receipts. Remember all those resources the DOI manages? The oil, the gas, the timber? Well, they generate a lot of revenue through things like royalties, leases, and permits.
So, let me get this straight. The DOI is tasked with regulating these industries, but they're also profiting from them.
That's the gist of it, and it's a point of contention, for sure. Some argue it's a conflict of interest, that the DOI might be more inclined to prioritize resource extraction over conservation efforts. After all, that's where a big chunk of their funding comes from.
It's like being both the referee and the star player in the same game. You're bound to raise some eyebrows.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the most hotly debated topics in recent years, Biden's 30 by 30 plan. The goal is to conserve 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030. Sounds great on paper, right?
Yeah, who doesn't love the idea of protecting our natural spaces? But our source material suggests that not everyone is thrilled about it, especially in the West.
Right, there's a lot of concern, particularly among ranchers, farmers, and those who rely on public lands for their livelihoods. They worry about losing access to land for grazing, logging, and other economic activities.
So it's not just about conservation, it's about people's lives, their history, their connection to the land. It's complicated.
It's incredibly complicated. And then you have the issue of national monuments, which have also been a source of tension for decades.
Remind me again how those work. The president can just decide to protect a big chunk of land.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The Antiquities Act of 1906 gives the president the power to create national monuments to protect areas of natural, cultural, or scientific significance. And while it's been used to protect some incredible places, the Grand Canyon, Bears Ears, it's also been criticized as a form of presidential overreach.
Because it bypasses Congress, right? So there's less opportunity for debate and input from local communities who might be directly impacted by these designations.
Exactly. And that brings us to a place that knows a thing or two about complicated relationships with the federal government. Alaska.
Ah, Alaska. Land of rugged beauty, abundant resources, and a history with the DOI that's as wild as its landscape. What makes Alaska so unique in this whole equation?
Well, you've got a state that's rich in oil, gas, timber, minerals, you name it. But it's also fiercely independent with a deep distrust of federal overreach.
And a lot of that tension stems from the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, right? ANCSA for short.
Exactly. ANCSA was a landmark agreement aimed at settling Aboriginal land claims and providing economic opportunities for Alaska Natives. It resulted in the largest land transfer from a government to its Native people in history.
Okay, so on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. What's the problem?
Well, while well-intentioned, ANCSA has led to decades of legal battles, bureaucratic hurdles, and ongoing disputes over land ownership and resource rights.
It's like trying to untangle a giant fishing net. Every knot you untie seems to create two more. And speaking of tangled webs, what are some of the big issues facing Alaska today when it comes to the DOI?
Well, the elephant in the room is drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR. It's a constant tug of war between those who see it as a vital source of domestic oil and those who believe that protecting this pristine wilderness should be paramount.
And then you've got the Ambler Road project, which would cut a 200-mile industrial road through the Alaskan wilderness to access mineral deposits. Talk about a recipe for controversy.
Right, you've got potential economic benefits on one hand, but concerns about the environmental impact on the other. And let's not forget about the impact on indigenous communities who rely on the land for subsistence.
It's a lot to juggle, and it highlights the delicate balancing act that DOI faces in Alaska, weighing economic development, environmental protection, and the interests of a diverse group of stakeholders.
It definitely highlights the challenges. And speaking of challenges, let's shift gears to another crucial aspect of the DOI's mission. Its trust responsibility to American Indian tribes.
This isn't just about managing land or resources, it's about upholding a moral and legal obligation rooted in centuries of broken promises and hard-fought treaties.
You hit the nail on the head. The DOI's relationship with tribal nations is arguably one of the most important and complex aspects of its portfolio. It's about protecting tribal sovereignty, promoting self-sufficiency, and ensuring the well-being of Native communities.
It sounds like a massive undertaking. What are some of the key challenges facing tribes today when it comes to the DOI?
Well, the historical baggage is huge. The legacy of broken treaties, forced assimilation, and the theft of land and resources continues to cast a long shadow over the relationship.
It's hard to move forward when you're still dealing with the wounds of the past.
Absolutely. And it makes building trust and finding common ground even more difficult.
What about present-day challenges? What are some of the issues that tribes are grappling with right now?
One of the most pressing is the lack of adequate funding and support for essential services, things like healthcare, education, infrastructure. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which operates under the DOI, has been plagued by mismanagement, underfunding, and bureaucratic inefficiencies.
It's like the very agency that's supposed to be advocating for their needs is failing them.
It's a sentiment echoed by many tribal leaders. And then there's the issue of tribal sovereignty, which is constantly being tested and challenged. Many tribes feel that the DOI oversteps its bounds, imposing regulations, making decisions about land use, and controlling resources without adequate tribal consultation or consent.
So how do we even begin to address these complex and deeply rooted issues?
Well, it's going to require a fundamental shift in the way the DOI approaches its relationship with tribal nations. It's about moving away from a paternalistic model of consultation towards a true partnership based on respect, transparency, and a willingness to listen and learn.
It sounds like a tall order, but a necessary one if we want to create a more just and equitable future for all Americans. And on that note, let's take a deep dive into some specific examples of how these policies are playing out on the ground and what the future might hold for this vast and complex department. All right, deep divers, welcome back. We've been wading through the murky waters of the DOI, talking big picture policies, but let's get down to brass tacks, shall we? How are these decisions actually playing out in the real world for everyday people?
Well, you know how they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions?
I've heard that one, yeah.
The BLM headquarters relocation is a perfect example of that.
Oh, right, the BLM, that's the Bureau of Land Management, for anyone who doesn't have that acronym memorized.
Exactly. So back in 2019, the Trump administration decided to move the BLM's headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Grand Junction, Colorado.
On the surface, that sounds kind of reasonable, right? Get
Yeah.
the agency closer to the land it manages?
That was the idea, yeah. But it quickly became clear that the move was rushed, poorly planned, and honestly, a lot of folks felt it was more about politics than good governance.
And what happened? Did the BLM suddenly become a well-oiled machine out in Colorado?
Not exactly. The opposite, really. Experienced BLM staff, people with years of knowledge, they didn't want to relocate. Who could blame them? So you had this mass exodus of expertise, leaving the agency short-staffed and struggling to keep up.
Talk about a bureaucratic brain drain.
Exactly. And our source material suggests that this relocation actually made it harder for the BLM to do its job effectively.
So much for being closer to the action. It's like moving your fire department to a different state and expecting them to still put out fires in your neighborhood.
That's a pretty good analogy. This whole debacle highlights a larger issue within the DOI, and really within government in general. There's often a disconnect between those making the decisions and those on the ground, dealing with the consequences.
It's about listening to the people who are actually living and working on the land, right? Not just imposing decisions from some far-off office.
Exactly. Respecting local knowledge, understanding the needs of communities, and working together to find solutions. That's how we bridge that gap between policy and reality.
It's about finding that balance, right? Between protecting our natural resources and ensuring that people can continue to live and thrive in these communities for generations to come. It's not an easy task, that's for sure.
Definitely not. It's a constant juggling act, with high stakes and no easy answers. But I think the key is to keep the conversation going. Keep asking tough questions, demanding transparency and accountability from our elected officials, and working to find common ground.
I couldn't agree more. Well, folks, there you have it. A glimpse into the complex and often contradictory world of the Department of the Interior.
A world where politics, money, and the fate of our public lands collide.
It's a lot to digest, we know. But hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the forces at play and the challenges we face.
And maybe, just maybe, it sparked a fire in you to get involved, to make your voice heard, and to fight for the future you want to see.
Because at the end of the day, the future of our public lands is in all of our hands. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring.